Romans 12, verse 3 and following. Just to remind you, chapter 12 is another transition chapter. Paul has, in chapters 1 through 11, well, the first 3 chapters, he dealt with the universal condition of fallen mankind. Whether you are a pagan, whether you are a moralist, somebody who thinks they have high morals, or whether you're Jewish, doesn't matter. We're all in the same boat. We're in trouble. Then he deals with a lot of theological issues in chapters really 4 on through chapter 8. Get to chapter 8, he begins talking much about the Holy Spirit. Before, not a whole lot, but when he gets there, he mentions the Spirit many, many times. Chapters 9, 10, and 11 answers the question, what about the Jews? What about Israel? And Paul is correcting some thinking. He's anticipating all through this the kind of questions that people would ask of him. And he is approaching it from that angle. Chapter 12, through the balance of the book, he gets to the so what? So what? So what about the fallen condition of man? So what about the doctrinal stuff that he's talked about? So what about what the future for Israel is? Now he begins what we almost call application. So what do we do in response to it? One of the things that may be helpful to you to understand the structure of a lot of Paul's letters. Paul's letters, not exclusively, but generally speaking, he will begin dealing with either problems or doctrine or issues. Now, the book of Ephesians is packed with doctrine, but there's no problems that he's dealing with. 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, lots of problems. But yet, intermixed in there, he has a lot of application. But what happens, for example, if you take one of his letters, he'll give you doctrine up front, and then he gets to application. He's answering the question, so what? What do you do with it now? Since he said this, now what do you do with it? That's kind of where we are in the book of Romans. So we pick up with verse 3 of chapter 12. Well, let me back up again. He wants us to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. He urges, he pleads with readers, the Romans, and down through the centuries, any believer that will read this book, and us, that we present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is our reasonable service, or some translations will render that phrase, spiritual worship. And then he follows that up by saying, we should not be conformed to this world or this age, but should be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In other words, that's where the battle is in your mind. In your mind. That will be where the majority of it will be taking place. A lot of times when you talk about spiritual warfare and those kind of things, one of the things you need to remember is that the main battleground is in your mind. It's in your head. That's where the temptations come. That's where the questioning comes. That's where all this stuff happens, is right there between your ears. That's where Satan attacks. And he does it in a variety of ways. When he came to Eve and deceived her, it was through her rational faculties that he did so. Now, with that said, he tells us that we need to renew our minds. Meaning that there's a problem, right? If you got to renew your mind, it means there's some reason why you need to renew your mind. And it's how you and I think. If you and I really think and behave with our attitudes and our actions and our priorities, that this is it, this is what's the most important, is this life. If that's the way we think, that's the way we live. It makes no difference what else we might profess. It's your lifestyle. What's your priorities. That will indicate what you value. I heard a pastor once say, or actually I read this. He said, if I want to know a man's spiritual condition, I don't ask to see his Bible, I ask to see his checkbook. Because that's where your priorities are. Don't make any difference what you say. It's what do you do, you see. Now, so he's going to be talking about now what we are to do. Verse 3. For I say, through the grace given to me, now this is important, that he points out the grace that is given to him. Because he's going to emphasize that again, probably several times. To everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Okay? Don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to think. Now he's talking about, again, he's dealing with the issue that we talked about Sunday morning, our tendency to be self-centered beings. That is part of our spiritual DNA that's wrapped up in us, is that we think like that. But and sometimes we may elevate our thinking of ourselves, and we hold ourselves in higher opinion than we probably should. I'm going to just deviate for just a moment and want you to think about this. And sometimes you'll hear somebody say this: I just hate my life. And some of you teenagers are more prone to say that than others, but sometimes even full adults, even older folks, sometimes will say things like that. I just hate my life. Is that true? No, it's not. If they hated their life, they'd be glad that they're going through what they're going through. They don't. They don't hate their life. They really don't. And a lot of times people will indicate those kind of things, and that's not really where they're coming from. And you need to understand the way I'm hopefully using this, because there can be a lot of reasons why people may harm themselves. And sometimes there's mental issues that can be involved. It can be sometimes panic issues. Sometimes it's just for a variety of reasons. There's no one reason that I want to paint with a broad brush. But I want to tell you something. Suicide is a supreme selfish act. You just need to know that. Now, I'm not saying that the person who commits it is aware of that. But if you have ever been close to someone who's committed suicide, you realize the turmoil that's left in their wake. And it can be very, very well. It's probably one of the most difficult deaths to deal with is a suicide. It just is. But the person who commits it is not the one that's going to receive the greatest amount of turmoil. It's those that are left behind. And I tell you, the anger, the confusion, the guilt, and all that brings will be for those who are left behind. They'll be thinking, why did they do this? Why didn't I notice? How come, or why did I not prevent this? I should be aware. You hear what I'm saying? So that's why I say it is the ultimate selfish act, because it's those who are left behind, friends, family. Those folks are the ones who struggle the most. Now, he says, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. Don't misunderstand and say that I need to be humble. At least it's to people look at humility. Woe is me. I'm just going to eat worms. Yeah. That kind of thing. No, he's not talking about that. He said he's not saying you think little of yourself. He's simply saying you don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. Don't immediately go to the other extreme and think that's what Paul's talking about. That's not what he's talking about. He's not what he's talking about. Within every congregation, especially in the ancient world, this is what the Corinthian problem in chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians. The problem there was you had people of different economic statuses there, standing, classes. Some of those people had plenty. Some of those people had nothing. And the problem is the ones who had plenty lived like it, ignoring the ones who had little or nothing. Even in the realm of spiritual gifting, which he's going to get to in just a moment. But in 1 Corinthians, he really gets to it. And the thing he points out there is simply, you're elevating these certain gifts as if somehow you're the one that generated these things. You didn't. They are gifts, and they're not for you. And the gift that they prized the most was what, you think? The Corinthians now.
Speaking in tongues.
Yeah. Glossolalia. Tongue speaking. See, meaning because he has to deal a whole chapter on that. So obviously that was the one that was out of kilter. And Paul did not forbid it. He just built, as it were, fences around how it was to be practiced. Okay? So don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. Stay away from spiritual pride. And sometimes people have spiritual... I know nobody here would ever experience something like that. But sometimes people do have, or Christians will have a sense of spiritual pride. Looking down upon others as if they are, quote, less spiritual, end quote, than others might be. I'm more spiritual than someone else. Depending on how you define those words. Okay? Well, anyway, let's go on. We'll get to the more application here. And it says, but you ought to think, this one says soberly. Literally, the idea is to think correctly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. Now, this is interesting. Now, I'm not saying that if you pray that God will, for faith, that God won't strengthen your faith. But there are people that seemingly have a gift of faith. I'll tell you about a man. He about drove me nuts, but I'll tell you about him. He was actually the father of a suite mate I had in college. Now, the suite mate I had in college was one of those guys that was just, common sense was simply not common with him. I can kind of tell you, David Bell was his roommate. David comes in one evening on Friday or Saturday night, kind of late to the room, and he comes in and he finds somebody else in his bed. What it was his roommate's friend that just stopped by, so his roommate generously gave David's bed to his friend. Okay, that was something about him. Okay. But it was in Cahokia. A guy comes there, a man comes, and he's an older gentleman, and he's driving a RV, and he stops, he comes in, he talks to me. And he talks, and he talks, and he talks, and he talks, and he informs me that, I noticed there's, milk was, I don't know if it was at Walgreens or what it was, but milk was on sale there. He said, I don't even have enough money for milk. Okay, so I figured that he's there to ask for money. He didn't. But what he was, now he was the father of this young man I told you about a moment ago. Anyway, he just traveled, and he just trusted God to give him wherever he wanted. And it was interesting as I got to talk to him. He began showing me pictures of some of what he called his ministry and whatnot, and I was stunned. He was pictured with some very powerful people, politicians, whatnot, and the picture that was most impressive to me, he and Sam Walton were standing right there. I said, wow. Now, I say gift of faith. Now, some other people think, well, that's presumption. But that's how he lived. That's how he lived. Now, not every one of us in this room would feel comfortable living that way, would we? Probably not. There's a principle here. Notice the principle. As God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. You see that? So who is involved in the level of faith that a person may have? God's Spirit, for sure. All right. Matter of fact, we get to 1 Corinthians. It talks about the spiritual gifts. The giver of the gift is the Holy Spirit. And He gives them the way He wants. So, and that was to clarify to the Corinthians that there's a lot of spiritual gifts that the Holy Spirit gives, and they're for His purposes. Not yours. His. Okay. For we have many members in one body, but all the members do not have the same function. And that's helpful too. When you look at it, now he's going to use this image again when he gets to chapter in 1 Corinthians. He develops it much more. But there, what he does is he points out that what God does, in His Spirit does, is He enables certain people to have certain kind of spiritual gifts, and those gifts are to benefit everyone else in the church. And we know that they're not all just alike. Can't be. He uses the metaphor of the human body. Let me use a different metaphor. You appreciate this one. A baseball team. Now, what would you have if you had a baseball team composed of 9 pitchers? Yeah. It would be strikeout, right? Every time you went to the plate. No, you don't need that. You don't do that. You need you do need a pitcher, though, don't you? But you don't need 9 of them. You need a catcher, you need a first baseman, second baseman, third baseman, you need a shortstop, you need some outfielders. You need those folks. Because each one is playing the same, or in the same game, but they're playing a different position with different responsibilities and different skill sets. Right? All right. I think you get that. And we could talk about a band or an orchestra. Orchestra is even a better example because of all of those different instruments. You hear. How many of you just, if I could bring a CD in here and offer to sell it to you of just tuba, how many of you would line up to buy a tuba CD? Would you drop $20 just so somebody go boom, boom, that thing? You wouldn't, would you? But when he plays his part in conjunction with all the other instruments, it sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Yeah. Now, he's talking about, that's what he's talking about here, using the image of a body, but all of the members do not have the same function. They don't. And actually, if you would think about it, think about the human body, just some of the senses that we have. Could you imagine what it would be like for you to come in here this evening and right up here on the front, this table right here, was a 6-foot eye? But he could see well. Yeah. Well, what else could he do? But assuming it was a he eye, not a she eye. Okay. You know, how many of you hang out in here if you had a big old eye, blinking at you? I think I'd kind of go out in the hallway. I don't think I'd be comfortable. How about a big old ear? You see the point. It's silly, I know, but you get the point. So what happens in a church? What happens in a church is there'll be a lot of different people who have different giftings and different ministries, and they fit in different ways that others don't. It's just the way it works, by God's design. Now, what often happens in a church is someone will look at someone else and say, I wish I was like that. And that is a wrong way to be. And another aspect of the spiritual gifting is if a person is not involved in the ministry of a church when he or she should be, and they're not, then they are, and the language is going to be kind of strong here, but they are robbing everybody else. How can I say that? Well, if I just flip over a few pages, I want you to listen to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. In verse 7, he says, "But the manifestation of the Spirit is given to each one for the profit of all," or for the common good. Your spiritual gifting is not for you. It's for the rest of us. Okay? That's what it's for. It's not to make you puffed up like the Corinthians were, but your spiritual gifting was given for the purpose to benefit other people in the church. And, of course, what you have, to carry the metaphor a little bit further, there are those parts of the body that are clearly visible. Whether someone can sing well, or someone can do some ministry well, some physically thing well, you see that. But that doesn't mean that's the only thing that's important. There are ministries that people within a church can participate in where they're never visible, but they're vital. How many of you see your heart in here? I'm talking about the organ, the real one, in your chest. Not the metaphor, but the actual heart. Or kidneys, or pancreas, or a lot of other lungs, brain. You don't see those, do you? Are they not important? They're critically important. So when I talk about ministries, I'm not talking about simply those things that are seen or noticed. There are other ministries within a congregation that are absolutely essential, that don't get the same kind of, they don't have the same visibility as other ministries. If somebody has really the gift of singing, you see them sing. But what about someone who's got the gift of encouragement? You don't see that unless you're the one receiving the encouragement. Or if someone does have the gift of faith, or has the gifting of prayer, you don't see that visibly. But nevertheless, you see how vital it really is? That makes sense to you? Everybody clear on that? Anybody want to fuss back or push back on it? Give you the opportunity to do that. He goes on. "So we, being many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another." This is if one of the aspects that the modern church needs to rediscover is this, especially in our nation. And what I mean by that is, we don't understand anymore how important we are to other people and how important they are to us. We don't. Let me give you this example. I'll give you a couple examples because this has been the issue. We live in a culture, and you can see it now demonstrated more than it ever has in the past, where we're the individuals, right? We're individuals. I talked about Truman's book, the rise of the modern self, the rise and triumph of the modern self. What you have is, that's why someone who gets their feelings hurt suddenly becomes a center of attention, and you can't hurt anyone else's feelings, because if you say that hurts their feelings. You can't do that because now they're so elevated, their feelings are more important than what you think, so to speak. Now, I'm not trying to pursue that, but what often happens is we have that kind of culture, And you can see that by some of our heroes. The kind of heroes that we see in, at least at one time in the movies. We have someone like John Wayne in some of his movies. Or maybe more, maybe the Rambo movies. My goodness, that one man could take on the Russian army and win. I mean, come on. He don't need anybody else. You give him his knife and a bunch of mud and he's set. Well, that's not real. That's not real. Maybe to stick with the movie motif here might be helpful. And I'm not saying... How many of you have watched some of the... What the name of it? Like the Fellowship of the Ring. You know, the Lord of the Rings? You ever watch that movie? It lasts forever. And then there's three of those movies, and interestingly, they filmed them all at the same time because they didn't want the actors to age too much. But that's another story. The interesting thing about that, though, and I hope you don't miss this, it wasn't just simply the effort of one. It was the effort of a fellowship, which is kind of a really break from a lot of American type movies. Of course, Tolkien wrote it, and he wasn't American; he's British, so maybe that's why. But let me say it this way: if I have a bag of marbles and a bag of grapes, they can look very similar. But the grapes, if they're pressed, what happens? They squeeze and they may bleed on each other, right? Now if I have that bag of grapes, and if I don't have something really, really heavy, if they're smashed together, what happens? They just ricochet off each other. And a lot of times, what we see in churches is we're like a bag of marbles. Hard, individual, and he's going to get deeper into this in just a moment. And that's one of the things that is a glaring statement about modern Christianity as opposed to first century Christianity. In the first century, if you were going to survive, you had to depend upon your fellow Christians, or you may not survive. It was that important. We get things from the ancient world. It gives us glimpses. And some of those things come from pagan sources. And one writer was given the task and wrote up his findings. Caesar asked him to find out about this new sect. These people, followers of the way, as they were called at first. What something to worry about, in other words, or be concerned of. And he came back with a report that they gather on the first day of the week to worship Christ, who they claim to be God, and they refer to each other as brother or sister in family terms. Don't forget that; it's important. And he talked about some of the things that Christians did. And then he said, but they really seem to love each other. From inside the churches of yesteryear, you'd find things like statements like this, that we share everything except our wives. We share everything else. During one of the plagues that was in the Roman Empire, even the doctors, they fled. They weren't treating people, but often Christians stayed behind to try to help people, even at the cost of some of their own lives, helping with. So you see something remarkably different, and Paul is hinting at that. Even as the description goes of some of the events when Christians were being made sport of, The Roman culture became kind of a lazy culture, and they liked their reality TV a lot. Of course, not literally TV. But they would go, and one of the things, in the Colosseum was not only the gladiator fights, but there was also the execution of Christians. And they brought whole families in and turned starved animals, lions on them, tied them to bulls and whatnot, to be gored to death. And it was quite interesting. The reason why the culture of the Romans at that time found it less than satisfying to watch this is because of how the Christians responded in those kind of conditions. And it was like they couldn't quite figure this out. There wasn't a lot of screaming and begging to be free, but they would put children in the middle. The women would bend up over the children, and then the men would cover the women. And that's what they would do. And often they would sing, they would pray as they were being attacked. And it was so different that the pagans couldn't understand what was happening. And it was because of these close ties that Christians had with each other. He's talking about this. Verse 6, he's talking about gifts. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, let us prophesy in proportion to our faith. Or ministry, let us in our ministering. He who teaches in teaching, he who exhorts in exhortation, he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. You see, he ties those things together, and he's not being exhaustive about the use of spiritual gifts, but he has given us some of those. Those in prophecy. Now, what does he mean by prophecy? Well, there's two basic meanings of prophecy. One is what normally people think about is foretelling the future. But the most often gift that's used or manifestation of prophecy was not merely the foretelling of the future, it was the foretelling of what God was demanding from His people. So what you have in the prophets is you have preachers telling God's people what God has said and what they should do. It wasn't merely, and we usually reduce it down to simply telling about future events, but that wasn't the total function of a prophet. Read Isaiah. Read Jeremiah. Read Ezekiel. Read those people, and Hosea and Amos, etc., and Zechariah. You read that, and you'll see that they had more than just simply talking about the future. They had this. They were dealing with the here and the now as well. So he talks about that. Verse 9. Let love be without hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is a very neat word. To kind of simplify it, we can use the word play actor. Everybody, you know what a hypocrite is, right? It's someone who pretends to be something that they're not. If I can remember the quote, there was an old Hill preacher who said, "If you is who you ain't who you is." As a hypocrite. A hypocrite. A hypocrite pretends to be what they really are not. So let love be without hypocrisy. Let it be genuine, in other words. Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with, here it is, brotherly love. In honor, giving preference to one another. In other words, you put others before yourself. Now, if we were, say, hypothetically, because it's not really a hypothetical thing, it happens all the time. Say a church gets together and they decided, what color are we going to paint this room? Now, every one of us here probably has a color preference. You think? Sure we do. We've got a color we like. And we begin thinking about that and said, well, I think we ought to paint it blue. Someone says, oh, no, not blue. Blue makes you blue. It's not a refreshing color. I think it should be orange. orange is dated. That's the 70s. We don't need orange back and shag carpet. No, we don't want that. So it wouldn't take long, especially if you have a strong preference. Listen to me. If you have a strong preference for a color, it doesn't take long before people get at odds with each other over the color to paint a room. Now let me ask you a question. Now there are some colors you don't want to paint a room because it just doesn't. It's just yeah, I agree with that. But I will tell you this: there are some of you here, probably ladies, you know a lot more about color than I do. You really do. I don't know how stripes and checks go together, if they do. I mean, that's why I kind of like to stay with primary colors. So black, you can go with anything black. So you're cool, But I don't know. So does it not make more sense if someone's got a gifting other than I do, and they have a different preference than I might have, to yield to their preference because they know more about it than I do? Is it worth getting into an argument about or causing hard feelings because of a color of something that 100 years nobody's going to care? Are you with me? Mm-hmm. President Reagan had a plaque on his desk that really helps in this respect. Now, he wasn't a Christian plaque or whatever it was. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something like this: that one can get a lot done if you don't care who gets the credit. Oh, that's quite interesting. And we're told here that we give preference to others. Now, don't misuse that. I mean, if somebody is doing something that's wrong, it doesn't mean that you yield to them in their preference or anything like that, but you understand what it means. Don't be so bent on getting your way. How do I know if you're bent on getting your way? Well, if you're out with a group of people, do you have to go eat where you want? Or your pal, if you don't get to go there? Ponder that a little bit. Sometimes you maybe yesterday you ate pizza and they want to go eat pizza again today. You don't want to eat pizza again today. But do you demand your way? If everybody else wants pizza and you don't? What else did he say? He goes on. Not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer, distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. By the way, it's either to weep with those who weep than rejoice with those who rejoice. It's easier. It really is. Usually because we can be given to jealousy pretty easily, or covetousness, when someone, rejoice with those who rejoice. It's not always easy. Weeping with those who weep, it's easier. Go on. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Okay. This is a toughie. Because sometimes even Peter had problems with this. In Galatians, Paul, in front of everybody, chews Peter out. What was Peter doing? Well, Peter was having a good time hanging out with the Gentiles until some Jewish people, leaders from the Jerusalem church, showed up. When they showed up, in order to remain in high standing in their eyes, in their estimation, Peter began to really sequester himself away from the Gentiles, because he knew how they would think if he continued being with the Gentiles. So he just separated himself from the Gentiles in order to impress the people who came from the Jerusalem church from James. And Paul said, that just ain't right. And told him so in front of everybody. It's kind of like that. Are there people who are... Now, he's talking primarily about Christians, but it can apply broader than that at times. Are there certain people that you just simply would not allow to sit at your table? If they sit at your table, you got to move somewhere else? You think of, just kind of ponder that. Sometimes you'll discover that. If someone came to church that was way different, what would we do there? Do you know that Gandhi actually tried to go to church once? He walked into the church because he had been reading a little bit of the New Testament, and he was kind of enamored of this guy, Jesus. So, as the story goes, he walks into a church, and he's met there with an usher, and the usher told him, politely, but said, you'll be happier somewhere else. Let me escort you to the door. Now, he left and never went back. Because if that's what Christianity is, he didn't want any part of that. Isn't that something? Apparently, it's a true story. A true story. And we need to be aware of those kind of things. I tell you, I grew up in if you know where, most of you know where Branson is. I didn't grow up in Branson. I grew up back east of Branson. 7 miles from the nearest town, and it was less than 100 people. So the first time I took Tara where I lived, she was kind of like, what is this? Because we kept driving way further from civilization. Then I turn a hill and go up. Amo, you've been there. Come up, you go down in that holler. And she was kind of concerned about that. That's where I grew up. And it was just, everyone was like, everyone I went to school with was just like me. We were all kind of in the same boat. There was no wealthy people. There was no privileged people. Well, Tammy Jones was kind of privileged, but the rest of us weren't. Anyway, don't get into all that. But anyway, in the mix of that, it was kind of like, I never knew anything different until I went to college. And I went to college. It was like, well, here's a gal from Afghanistan. Here's several African countries. One, Ethiopia as well, which it is in Africa. And then there was a guy from Crete, a Greek from Crete. And then, just people from different students from different places. Like that was really. I found that at first, wondering about it as time went on. It was pretty cool. Be around people of other nationalities. They just saw the world differently than I did. I remember, I didn't know him very well, but I remember a young man named Paul Bass. He was from Africa, and he was going wild one morning in the kind of the common area in the dormitory I lived in. I mean, what is going on with him? Well, do you remember Idi Amin? No. Idi Amin was on the television doing something, and Paul Bass was just going wild. I never understood why, but I could tell he was not a fan. I'll just say that. So you get, there's that interesting aspect. But it'd be easy to kind of sequester yourself away from people who are radically different than you are. That's all he's saying. Don't do that. Let me go on before our time gets away. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all men or all people. I had a good friend in southeast Arkansas. He's a pastor from a neighboring town. And he told me one time, said, now, you need to know that I'm passive aggressive. Okay, give me Sammy. Sammy, you're passive aggressive? What do you mean by that? He said, well, for example, if I'm waiting to go somewhere and you're coming with me and you make me late, next time I'll get you back. I'll retaliate. He didn't use the word retaliate, but he said he'll get you back. He said, I'll make you late next time. Well, as he points here, don't repay evil for evil. You got me, wait, I'll get you back. How many of people live like that? Yeah, a lot do. Don't do that. And if possible, as much as it depends upon you, live at peace with all people. Amen. Doesn't mean you can, right? Jesus didn't live at peace with everybody, did he? Agree with me, because it's true. No, he didn't. But the point here is as much as it depends upon you. Live at peace with that. Doesn't mean you're going to live at peace with everybody. There are people that just don't like you. They just don't like you at all. And it may not be any fault of your own. You may just look like somebody that they don't like too, and they just carry it over. I don't know. But as much as it depends upon you, don't be the person who is doing that. What the Scripture instructs us. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Now, I know how y'all think. I'm going to be nice to that person. That way I'll heap coals on their head. That's the way I'll get them. And that's not exactly the spirit of what the Apostle Paul is trying to communicate there. He's quoting from Proverbs, actually. He's talking about don't respond in kind. If your enemy, the one that doesn't like you, you're not really causing the issue. You're trying to live at peace with this person. But if they don't, said do good things for that person. Don't try to get them back like they've got you. Just try to respond in a way that is kind and concerned for them. You'll surprise some people. You will. They're not expecting it, you see. They're not expecting it. And then he concludes. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Overcome evil with good. That's not easy, but that's the target. Don't be the source of evil. Don't return and avenge yourself because of evil. Don't do those kind of things, but rather what you do is you don't find yourself overcome with evil, but you overcome evil with good. And none of the things that the Apostle Paul is giving us as far as application here is going to be easy in our own strength. It's just not. It's not what we want to do at times. But it's what we ought or should do. Questions or comments? Too close to the end, right, to ask a question. I know what you're thinking. By the way, kind of a preview of coming attractions. What is the legitimate responsibility of a government? Maybe you're thinking, where is that coming from? It's chapter 13. It's chapter 13.
Speak on behalf of the people.
Okay. What is a legitimate function of government? By the way, believe it or not, God ordained it. We can't survive without it. Now, there are some pitiful examples of government because they're composed of politicians that usually are a part of that, for the most part. And you know, we've talked about before, if you break the word down, you know what a politician is, right? Poly means many, and ticks are a parasite. So we kind of get the idea of what a politician is, okay? All right, well, if you don't have anything else, I will set you free.